soon as you find Lamentations chapter 3, then if you would go to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And if I can help you find that place in the Bible, if you can find Psalms, then Proverbs, then you'll come to the book of Ecclesiastes, and you could turn to chapter 3 in that book also. We'll begin in Lamentations. We'll come back to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And by the way, you don't have to worry about me preaching very long. I've heard you have to study to do that. And I'm not about to start that now. And I, Brother John, I'm not looking to pastor. I've heard you have to work hard to do that. So, the last 12 years that my former pastor was here, Brother Jack Hiles, he and I traveled together 15 to 25 times a year those last 12 years to speak in conferences together all over the country and some a little bit around the world, different places. And in one of those conferences, we flew to, I think it was Rochester, New York, on Monday, as we often did, and we drove from there to Palmyra, New York. We preached Monday night, Tuesday morning, and Tuesday night in a public high school auditorium because the church wasn't large enough to hold the crowd. And then Wednesday morning early, we were driving back from Palmyra to Rochester. We left well before daylight. We'd been driving probably 45 minutes or so. Brother Hiles was in the back seat behind the driver. I was in the back seat on the passenger side. And there was a couple of young men taking us to the airport. In fact, you might know him, Brother Dollar, know of him at least. Brother Mark Bushy was driving, and Brother Tom Bish was in the front seat on the other side. They were assistant pastors at the church at the time. And Brother Hiles was, I've thought several times today, your pastor reminds me a great deal of Brother Hiles. And Brother Hiles was always cutting up with people and laughing and making fun of people. And he had been making fun of Brother Bushy about how he was driving. And we had all been laughing and having a big time like you often do around your pastor. But after about 45 minutes, it kind of dawned on me that everything had gotten quiet in the car for a few moments. And we were driving along the ridge of a mountain. And out of the corner of my eye, I could see the sparkle of a tear running down Brother Hiles' cheek. You know, from the glow of the speedometer, you know, that greenish glow in the old speedometers that used to be. And I turned and I said, Brother Hiles, what are you thinking about? And he pointed out the window on my side of the car, and there was a little village down in a valley. I found out later it was Lyons, New York. Probably 75 or 100 houses at the most. It was a switching yard, railroad switching yard, and these houses had built up around it. And he said, Ray, for the last several moments, I've been noticing that every few moments another light comes on in one of those houses down there as someone's getting up. And he said, I was just thinking, every one of those lights represent a broken heart. And he said, I was just wondering if maybe someday one of our graduates would come to that little town and maybe pastor those people and fall in love with them and pray for them when they're sick and preach their funerals and marry their young and help them rear their children and visit them when they're in the hospital. And I've thought several times today that when Brother Hiles started Hyles Anderson College, he had a couple exactly like Andy and Debbie Dahl in mind that would someday graduate and just go to some little place and fall in love with some people and just stay there year after year and pray for them and love them. I know Brother Hiles is not here to see it with his physical eyes, but I believe his heart's happy tonight. I know our Savior's heart is happy that you have worked together with your pastor to bring this church to where it is. And I am very honored, and I mean that as sincerely as I know how, to get to be here today. Thank you for allowing me the privilege. In the Bible, there was a young man by the name of Daniel. Daniel was born and was living in the country of Israel, probably in the city of Jerusalem. And his country was invaded by a foreign land. And Daniel and several other people, thousands of others, were taken captive, and they were taken back to Babylon. While Daniel was in Babylon, the king Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and it concerned him. He wanted one of his wise men to interpret the dream, but none of them could. And so God gave the interpretation to Daniel. And when Daniel interpreted the dream for Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar put Daniel in charge of the entire kingdom, made him second in command in the entire kingdom. Many years later, there was another king there in Babylon. His name was Belshazzar. One night, Belshazzar was hosting a drunken feast. And in the midst of that drunken feast, they were mocking God. They had taken the golden vessels, the cups and so forth, that had been stolen from the temple in Jerusalem, and they had brought them back to Babylon. His father had done that. I'm sorry, I don't remember if it was his father or not, but anyway, a former king. But they took those golden vessels, and they were drinking wine out of them. And in the midst of that drunken feast, suddenly a man's hand, or at least the fingers of a man's hand, appeared in the room and began to write something on the wall that no one could read. You've heard the phrase before, the handwriting on the wall. Well, that's what it came from that story in the Bible. Well, Belshazzar was so, the Bible says, affrighted or scared or shocked, that his knees began to knock together. You've heard the phrase, I'm so scared my knees are knocking. Well, that phrase comes from this story also. Well, the queen comes in and she says to Belshazzar, there is a man here in our kingdom who can interpret dreams. It may be he could interpret that handwriting up there. Why don't you call him in and see if he can and if he will? So Belshazzar calls Daniel in, and Belshazzar says to Daniel, I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and, notice this phrase, dissolve doubts. Belshazzar said to Daniel, I've heard you can dissolve doubts. You know, that's exactly what every husband in America ought to be doing right now, is dissolving the doubts of his wife. That's what every father in America ought to be doing right now, dissolving the doubts of his family. That's what every mother in America ought to be doing right now, dissolving the doubts of her children. That's what our news media should be doing, but they're dead sure not. And I know everybody's entitled to their own opinion, and I honestly don't mind you having your opinion, but in my opinion, that's exactly what President Trump tried to do on several occasions, was to dissolve our doubts. A few years ago, I was speaking to one of my adult daughters, and I was explaining an issue to her, and I could tell as I was explaining the issue that she was beginning to calm down. She was beginning to relax. And finally, she said with tears in her eyes, the problem is, every time a new issue comes up, my daddy is not here when I get home at night to calm my fears. Several years ago, my former pastor, Brother Hiles, taught a truth at our church. I don't remember what text he used. I don't remember the title of his sermon. But the truth that he taught in that message, God has used many, many times through the years to calm my fears. And what I'm praying tonight is that God will allow me to teach you some of what my pastor taught me several years ago, that maybe will be used by God to calm your fears. Would you look, please, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And I'm going to begin with verse 1. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. Now would you turn back just one page to chapter 1. In most Bibles it's just one page. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. And we're going to look at verse 9. Ecclesiastes 1:9 says, "The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be." Or that phrase is saying this: the thing that hath been, it is the thing which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun. That verse there is telling me that the thing that happened yesterday is going to happen tomorrow. Yesterday the sun rose in the east and set in the west, and tomorrow the sun will rise in the east and it'll set in the west. That verse is telling me that what happened last week is going to happen next week. That verse is telling me that what happened last month is going to happen next month. It rained a little bit last month, it's going to rain a little bit next month. That verse is telling me that what happened last year is going to happen next year. It snowed a little bit last year, it's going to snow a little bit next year. That verse is telling me that what happened in the last decade is going to happen in the next decade. Mark my word. I promise you, mark my word. You take today's date and you count back 10 years and you add up the number of hurricanes that we had here in America in the last 10 years, and you take today's date and you begin keeping records, and you keep records for the next 10 years, and 10 years from now you add up the number of hurricanes that we had here in America, and it'll be a very similar number to the number of hurricanes we had in the last 10 years. That verse is telling me that what happened in the last century will happen in the next century. Do you know that in the next century about the same percentage of the population is going to die as it did that died in the last century? Now, the news media, they'll try to make you think that the worst thing that ever happened in the history of mankind happened today while you had your television off for a few hours. You know, they'll try to make you think that surely America's going to be destroyed. If not tonight, it'll happen by tomorrow. I heard one gal say, we only have 12 years left. She said within the next 12 years, everything on the whole earth is going to be ruined if we don't put her in charge and do everything she says. Doesn't it sound kind of like a Batman cartoon? You know, the bad guys are coming and they're going to destroy the whole world. But I guarantee you 12 years from now, if Jesus doesn't come back, the sun will still rise in the east and set in the west. It'll still rain a little bit every month. 12 years from now, it'll still snow a little bit every year. 12 years from now, the geese will fly south in the fall. They'll come back north in the spring. 12 years from now, if Jesus doesn't come back, water will still run downhill. We'll all still be breathing oxygen. Most men will still like women. Most women will still like men. Women will still be giving birth to cute little babies, and grandparents will still be loving their grandchildren. Have you ever noticed how far off they are on the age of the earth? You know, they talk about it being millions and millions. Well, they kind of wore out that phrase. So now they talk about it being billions and billions of years old. But you know, if you want to know how old the earth is, all you got to do is look in the book. All you have to do is just do a little math and add it up, and it's very clear the earth's about 6,000 years old. Have you ever had one of those tests when you were in school called an open book test? You remember those? Didn't you just love those tests where you could just look in the book and find the answer? And with the answer right there in the book, and there's an open book test, and they can't find the answer, and they're that far off, millions and billions of years off. How in the world do you think they're going to narrow it down to we've only got 12 years left? You know, God said in Genesis, you don't need to turn there, but He said, while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Now, some would have you believe that it has finally gotten so bad, even here in America, that you can no longer be used by God. You can no longer have an influence for good and for right. You can no longer rear an old-fashioned family, a conservative, traditional, biblical Christian family. They'll try to make you believe you can no longer build a bus route. You can no longer build a Sunday school class. You can no longer see a teenager's life change for God. You can no longer have a strong marriage. They'll try to make you believe that you can no longer build an aggressive local Baptist church. They'll make you believe you can't get visitors to come to church or go soul winning and see folks baptized in the river. They'll make you think you can't do that anymore. And yes, I will admit the world has its problems tonight. But you know the world had its problems back in Babel, when God had to come down and confuse their languages. And from that day to this, day and night has not ceased, and the thing that hath been is that which shall be. Yes, America has her problems tonight, but you know they had problems back in Sodom and Gomorrah when God had to come down and destroy those cities. And from that day to this, the day and night has not ceased, and the thing that hath been is that which shall be. Yes, the world has its problems, and even America has been affected by those problems. But you know the children of Israel had problems when they refused to go into the promised land, and God made them wander for 40 years in the wilderness. But from that day to this, day and night has not ceased. And the thing that hath been is that which shall be. Yes, the world has its problems, but they had problems back in the nation of Israel when God sent them into captivity. And for 70 years they were in captivity. They were not just putting up with a president they didn't prefer. They were not just putting up with a legislator that was passing ridiculous laws. They were not just putting up with a school system that had gone berserk. They were actually in captivity. You say, well, Brother Young, I'm not sure that the last election was fair and they counted the votes right. These folks didn't even get to vote. They were living in a foreign country. And God told the prophet Jeremiah to tell them, build ye houses and dwell in them. That sounds like long-term plans to me. He said, plant gardens and eat the fruit of them. That's long-term plans. He said, take ye wives and beget sons, plural, and daughters, plural. That's long-term plans. He said, take wives for your sons, give your daughters to husbands, and seek the peace of the city. What God was saying was, go about the routine of life. What should we be doing here in America today? We ought to get up tomorrow morning, read our Bible, and pray and go to work. We ought to come home tomorrow night and feed our family and read the Bible and pray with them and go to bed. We ought to get up Tuesday morning and do the same thing, and Wednesday morning and do the same thing, and Wednesday night come to church, and Thursday do the same thing, and Friday and Saturday and next Sunday come back to church. And here in America today, you and I should be serving God and rearing our family and going about the routine of life. Don't let them tell you that you missed your chance. Don't let them cause you to think that God will not be able to do what He's done in the past. I don't have a God who can only promise He can do that. I don't have a God who only promises that He can do what He did in the past. I have a God who has promised He will do what He has done in the past. You remember when the children of Israel in captivity, thousands of them were there. There was a small remnant of the people left in Jerusalem, and they were living among the rubble of the city. The entire wall had been destroyed. Every house in the city had been burned. There were no jobs, hardly any food. People had dug out little cavities underneath the rubble of the city. They were living there underground in these little cave-like situations. And one day, Jeremiah the prophet, he gets out from under the rubble. He walks out into the midst of the city, and he looks around. And let's see what he says. Turn to Lamentations chapter 3. In Lamentations chapter 3, I'm going to begin with verse 21. Jeremiah is standing in the midst of the city. He's looking at the ruin and destruction. And he says in verse 21, this I recall to my mind. This, what's he talking about? He's talking about the ruined city. He's standing there in the middle of it, looking at it. Look back at verse 19. He said, remembering mine affliction and my misery, the wormwood and the gall. He's talking about all this ruin and destruction. Verse 21, this I recall to my mind, therefore I have anxiety. Therefore I have stress. Therefore, I have fear. That's not what he said, was it? He said, I have hope. Hope. Jeremiah, how do you have hope? All right, we'll look at verse 22. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Can I tell you tonight why America has not yet been consumed? It's not because I'm better than you. It's not because you're better than somebody else. It's not because we're better than them. It's not because there's more of us than there are of them. The reason America has not been consumed tonight is because His mercies are new every morning. You know, every morning when God gets up, well, I'm not sure God gets up, but every morning when I get up, God looks down from heaven and He says, I got to get some brand new mercies. Ray Young just woke up. I need some brand new compassions. Ray Young's about to get out of bed. Yes, America has her problems. But let's look and see what Jeremiah said in verse 24. The Lord is my portion, saith my soul. Therefore will I hope in the Republican Party. No, therefore will I hope in the president of my choice. No, Jeremiah said, I'll hope in him. The Lord is good unto them that wait for Him, to the soul that seeketh Him. It is good that a man should both hope, and I don't like these next words, and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. I don't want to quietly wait. I want to tell everybody how I feel. I want to tell everybody my opinion. I want to tell everybody, if you'll just sit down and shut up and do what I tell you to do, we'll straighten out this whole mess. But that's not what God says. God says if America is ever salvaged, it won't be because Ray Young's real smart. It won't be because you're smarter than somebody else. It'll be because of God's salvation. If our country's ever salvaged, it'll be because God salvages it. Now, it's for me and you to do exactly what the prophet said, to pray for the peace of the city and to seek the peace of the city. And it's our job to do our part, but we have to depend upon God to do the salvaging. Yes, America has its problems. But do you want to really want to go back to those good old days the way it used to be? If you want to go back to the good old days in America, then let's go way back. Let's go all the way back to that period of time, that 400-year period of time when the whole earth was plagued with the leprosy of slavery. And even America was affected by it. If you want to go back to the good old days, the way America used to be, okay, then let's go back to those days when we used to buy and sell each other. Is that what you want to do? Or if you want to go back to the good old days in America, the way it used to be, maybe we could go back to that time when our Vice President, Aaron Burr, shot and killed the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in a duel over a political argument. Or maybe if you want to go back to those good old days, the way it used to be in America, we could go back to like it was in my childhood. Those wonderful days of my childhood. Maybe that morning, that morning in November of 1963, when I was sitting in the classroom in the 3rd grade, and my teacher got up in front of the class and she said, "Boys and girls, get your books together. We're going home early today." It was about 11:30 in the morning, and I thought, hot dogs! Praise the Lord, we're going home early. And I got my books together, and we went out and got on the bus, and I sat down on the 3rd row right on the aisle. And across the aisle from me, there was a little boy. Well, he wasn't a little boy. I was in the 3rd grade. He was in the 4th grade. This big boy sitting across the aisle. His name was Chuck Mazik. He said, "Ray, do you know why we're going home early today?" And I said, "No." And I didn't care. We were just going home early. And he said, "They shot and killed our president this morning." Now, my little 3rd grade mind didn't fully comprehend all of that. But then he said, "But do you want to know the real reason why they're sending us home early?" He said, "Because the Russians are coming." He said, "They're going to attack us." He said, "They're trying to rush us home so we can be at home with our moms and dads before the Russians get here." I could just see 3 big old ugly Russian soldiers standing. Now, I don't know if all Russians are ugly or not, but they were that morning. And I sat there on the bus and cried all the way home. You want to go back to the good old days? Maybe we could go back to 19 1966, the day the man killed his wife and mother-in-law, and the next morning climbed to the top of the clock tower on the University of Texas Austin campus and shot and killed 15 people with a high-powered rifle before they could take him out. Or maybe we could go back to 1968 when Martin Luther King was assassinated, murdered, and riots broke out all over our country. You know, last summer we had what the news media called riots. I don't call them riots. I call them paid-for demonstrations. You know, they picked and chose which cities to hire those people and send them to. And in 1968, they didn't burn one police precinct and a couple of cars so they could get it on the news. They burned 20 and 30 square block sections of whole cities. Some of you, you remember, you saw it on the news. I remember the day, I think last summer there was 20-something cities that they had those demonstrations in. In 1968, it was over 100 cities. In 1968, I remember I was 12 years old. I remember the night we were sitting at the supper table. We were watching the evening news, the 5:30 national. Back then you didn't have news 24 hours a day. You got ready for that 5:30 national news. And we were sitting there watching it. And live on television, there was a helicopter hovering above an intersection in Los Angeles. A man pulled up to a traffic light, and a group of men swarmed his car, beat the windows out of his car, drug him out of his car, and on live television, I was watching it while I ate supper, they beat the man to death there on the street. And that kind of thing happened in 40 different places all around the nation. I remember the very next day my dad came home from work. He set me down on the couch next to my brother. I was 12. My brother was 16. My father was not a hothead. He was a very mild-mannered, soft-spoken man. But my father said, boys, today, while I was at work, and Mr. Lawler, our neighbor, I say he was our neighbor. He was, down the road quite a ways. We lived out in the country, and he was out across the pasture from us. And Mr. Lawler was a politician. They knew where Mr. Lawler was, and so they came to Mr. Lawler's house. My dad told us, he said, boys, they came to the Lawler house today, and they surrounded the house, and they tried to break in. They were going to bother Mrs. Lawler, and he said the sheriffs had to come and chase them off. And he said, while that was happening, he said, at the time, I didn't know it was happening. He said, but while that was happening, I was working. My dad was a carpenter. He said, another man and I were building a house together. We were in a neighborhood where there were nobody living yet. He said, when we finished work and we were driving out of the neighborhood, we came to the end of the neighborhood where now some folks lived. He said there was about 40 men across the road. They had iron pipes and bricks and tires and so forth and ball bats. And he said they wouldn't let us drive through. He said, so we stopped our trucks. We both opened the door of our two separate trucks, and we both rolled down the windows of our trucks. He said, I happened to have my pump shotgun behind the seat in the truck. Back then, everybody did, especially in the South. And he said the other man happened to have his .30-06 behind the seat of his truck. He said, we both racked in a shell, and the crowd dispersed. And then he said, and my little 12-year-old ears heard these words. Boys, I can't stay home from work tomorrow. I've got to go to work. If those men come back tomorrow, I was 12 years old. If those men come back tomorrow, you know where the guns are. I was 12 years old. I heard my father say, boys, a wounded man can shoot back and testify in court. A dead man can't do either one. You want to go back to the good old days, the way it used to be in America? Maybe we could go back to 1969 when 400,000, almost 500,000 teenagers and young adults, so-called adults, showed up in a man's cow pasture in Woodstock, New York, and had a 4-day, 4-night, non-stop rock concert, open drugs, open nudity, open sex like animals. You want to go back to the good old days? You remember the 1970s? You remember John Wayne Gacy and his 33 victims he buried in the basement of his house? You remember the 1970s when Jim Jones took 1,000 people down to Guyana, and when they figured out what he was doing, he talked them into drinking the poison Kool-Aid, and 909 of them died? Yes, America has her problems tonight, and America has had her problems. But you know, so has Germany, and so has China, and Japan, and France, and Iran, and Mexico, and Africa, and Russia, and North Korea. But in spite of all of those problems, day and night has not ceased. And the thing that hath been is that which shall be. And I'm glad I can stand here tonight and testify that during those tumultuous 1960s and 70s, that's when my mother got a tract out of the tract rack in the vestibule of the church, and one Sunday afternoon set me down on my bed after lunch and read that gospel tract to me, and with tears running down her face, she asked me if I wanted to be saved. I didn't understand it, but I didn't want to disappoint Mama, so I said I would, and I prayed. I didn't get saved then, but it was 1970 when by then we had quit going to church, and a bus came by my house and picked me up and took me to church. The first time I went to that church, I got saved. The second time I went, I got baptized. The third time I went, I was called to preach. That was in 1970. Don't let them tell you that you missed your chance. I believe that if Jesus doesn't come back 12 years from now, God will still be using this book to reveal Himself to us. 12 years from now, God will still be using the foolishness of preaching to save the lost. 12 years from now, God will still be using His Holy Spirit to comfort me and you. 12 years from now, if Jesus doesn't come back, some of you sitting right here in this room tonight will still be working on the bus route. You'll still be teaching a Sunday school class. You'll still be carrying a King James Bible. You'll still be passing out tracts. You'll still be winning folks to Christ. You'll still be bringing them to church. And 12 years from now, God will still be saving people. You know, in the last couple of years, I've had the privilege personally to go door-to-door soul winning with different pastors in the states of Texas, Massachusetts, West Virginia, Connecticut, Arizona, North Carolina, Nebraska, Montana, California, Indiana, Michigan, Mississippi, not to mention Mexico, Thailand, the Philippines, and Honduras. And I can testify tonight that in every one of those places, God is still saving people. Don't let them cause you to doubt. Don't let them get your spirit. That's what they're trying to do. They're doing everything they can to take your spirit away from you. And if they can get your spirit, they'll control you. And we are not to be controlled by them. We're to be controlled by Him. Don't you remember that it was while Nebuchadnezzar was the king? Nebuchadnezzar, remember how wicked that guy was? He was so wicked that God made him go out in the field and eat grass like an ox. But while he was the king, God used Daniel. While Ahasuerus was the king, remember how wicked that guy was? He was so wicked that one night his wife, the queen, didn't do what he wanted, so he kicked her out. So he needed a new queen, so he sent his servants to 127 different provinces, like states, and he said, get me a virgin from every province, and he auditioned every one of them before he chose his next queen. And during that mess, God used Esther. Do you remember when the Pharaohs were in charge? God used Joseph and God used Moses. You remember when Jezebel was... Jezebel? Who knows? We may have a Jezebel in charge of our country someday. I'm not calling any names. I'm just saying. But you know what? Jezebel was in charge. God used Elijah. While Caesar ruled the world from Rome, God used Paul. While Herod was cutting people's heads off, God used Peter and John. Remember in the 1960s when they told us within the next 10 years, all the oil will be gone in the whole world? Remember waiting in those big long lines to get a little bit of fuel when we had a so-called gas shortage? You remember in the 1970s when they told us that within the next 10 years we were going to have another ice age? You remember in the 1980s when they told us within the next 10 years acid rain is going to destroy all the crops of the whole world? You remember in the 1990s when they told us that within the next 10 years, the ozone layer is going to be destroyed? You remember in the 2000s when they told us within the next 10 years, both ice caps are going to melt? Isn't it amazing? In 30 years' time, they went from a new ice age to no more ice. And you know the most amazing thing about all that is, none of it happened. You know what we need to do tonight? we need to stop putting our fear in them, and we need to put our faith back in Him. Why don't we do that tonight? Why don't we just take a few moments here at this altar tonight and just tell God, okay, God, I'm done putting my fear in them. I'm going to refocus my faith in you. Day and night has not ceased, and the thing that hath been is that which shall be. And God's still in control. Let's have every head bowed and every eye closed. Who would say tonight, Brother Young, I'll have to admit, I have had my moments, and by the way, I'm admitting it myself. You know why I'm preaching this sermon? You know why most of us preachers preach most of the sermons we preach. It's because we need it. And I'm admitting, I've had my moments. There have been moments that I thought, now what are we going to do? There have been moments when I thought, where do we go from here? What's next? But who would admit tonight, yes, Brother Young, I've had some of those moments before in my lifetime. Would you slip your hand up? Would you admit that to God tonight? Thank you. You may put it back down. Now, who would say tonight, I don't want my fear in them. I want my faith in Him. Would you raise your hand tonight? Would you keep it up real high for a moment? Thank you. You may put it back down. Why don't we take just a brief moment and tell God on our knees, if that's possible, if not just sitting, but here at this altar, why don't you come tonight and tell God that's what you want to do? Would you stand at this time? As the piano begins to play, would you come right now?